You could have been anywhere in the world today, but here with me, and I appreciate that. Um, this is a topic I've been kind of playing around with for the better part of my entire time as an educator, and it kind of culminated with my innovator experience. And I don't know if I was ready for this topic to be as relevant and significant as it is now when I kind of first started on this path. So I want to thank you for being here today. This is the first time I've really had a chance to talk about this experience and this topic. This is the audacity of light. I want to take the opportunity today to kind of reevaluate today's classrooms as learning spaces because the idea of a classroom has evolved so rapidly over the last 5, 10 years beyond what I think a lot of people are really aware of, beyond simply just conceptual ideas of what an ideal would be. And, it's evolved with pedagogies as well as research on, students' interaction with content. And I think that where we see ourselves right now, I feel like we would have been there 5 to 10 years from now. And as our realities have accelerated where we need to be based on the needs of today, it's a fascinating look at rethinking what exactly a classroom is. Um, and I'm going to get to this idea of a classroom because by the time I was done teaching, I didn't really have a classroom. And I'll get to what I mean about that. Before I begin, I just kind of want to introduce myself. My name is Devin Rossiter. I'm originally from Staten Island, New York. Lived there until I went to college. Moved out to Bakersfield, California, to become a sixth grade teacher. For among other things. In fact, I think I should probably start by kind of getting into that idea. I mentioned college, and I would be remiss if I didn't send a tremendous debt of gratitude to the city of Boston. New York City made me, but Boston refined me. I am a graduate of Northeastern University, and people know Boston as a great college town, but they don't know too much about Northeastern. Northeastern University is a 5-year cooperative education university. It's in the top 40. It wasn't when I attended. I don't know if I would have gotten in with what I had then, what I know now. But it's a cooperative education university, which means that the first year looks very broad, very traditional. Your semesters, your 9 months of school, then you get your summer off. But at Northeastern, that's your last summer off because the rest of your time, the 4 remaining years, you're in the classroom for 6 months, on a semester, off a semester. And then for the other 6 months, you are placed in a full-time paid position in your field of study. If you wanted to work in finance, you might be working for the John Hancock Financial Group. If you wanted to work with marketing, you might be hired to work with Gillette. If you wanted to be a journalist, you would work with the Boston Globe. Northeastern has a very unique connection network with companies throughout not just New England, but across the United States and the world. So whatever you want to do as your field of study, you don't have to wait until you graduate to do it. My field of study was sports broadcasting. As a resident of New York City, I lived and died falling asleep to the New York Mets every single day. I could wake up with a photographic vision of what happened the night before, thanks in part to a gentleman by the name of Bob Murphy and his broadcast partner, Gary Cohen. Those two were the voices of the New York Mets on WFAN Sports Radio 66 in New York City throughout my childhood. They taught me what I understand about storytelling, about building a narrative, about engaging an audience. And so when I went to Northeastern, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to study to become a sports broadcaster. That was my dream. Northeastern University, through their cooperative education program, allowed me to get that experience. First, through the student radio station as the play-by-play voice of the Northeastern Huskies. For 5 years, this was my office, Matthews Arena. Matthews Arena is the oldest indoor ice rink in the world. It was built and completed in 1910. It was opened 2 years before the Titanic sunk. In fact, it was one of the very first indoor buildings to have a balcony over the playing surface. If you notice the balcony behind the goals, that front row is actually directly over the glass. So there's nothing separated these bloodthirsty, vociferous fans in a building with a wooden roof and steel support structures from opposing goalies. To be specific, my broadcast booth was right there in the catwalks. It was only accessible through a very steep steel diamond plated incline that may have been painted over twice in the 100-year history of the building. But it allowed me the perfect vantage point for broadcasting hockey. Now, there wasn't a lot of technology up there. As a student broadcaster, our technology incorporated of a box that was attached to a phone cord that we would then dial into our radio station, and they would put our feed through as if it was a phone call. So basically, what you heard was me and my partner on the phone. Now, we had stats that we could work with. We had a microphone that we could put over the box so that we could pick up some natural sound. But for what it needed to be, for us to be able to do our job as broadcasters, and we took our role very seriously, where other student stations, kids would come in straight from the frat parties with a t-shirt, maybe jeans. We were the ones that showed up with a tie and a button-down shirt to really set that tone. This is what we came to study. This was our day at the office. One of the other opportunities I had at Northeastern University was learning from the best in their workspaces. My professor was the play-by-play voice of the Boston Red Sox. His office was the broadcast booth at Fenway Park. His name's Joe Castiglione. You'll see him over on the far right. He has been the voice of the Boston Red Sox for over 30 years. He has seen the lows and highs all the way from the World Series they lost in 1986 to the first one they won in 2004. I got to be a producer for that. For many games, I was off this frame in the producer's seat behind our announce team here. This was taken in 2018, several years after I graduated. The three gentlemen here, going from left to right, Sean McDonough, Dave O'Brien, and Joe Castiglione, bring various approaches and styles. This is the radio team, and I want you to take a look at how their booth is set up that allows them to do their job efficiently and effectively. Now, of course, the star of the show is going to be the game over here. However, each of the gentlemen have a certain setup that fits their style. For example, Joe Castiglione is an older gentleman, so he has a monitor tied in so that he has a better look at what's happening on the field, so that he's able to efficiently and effectively describe what's happening to the listener at home. Dave O'Brien has a somewhat different perspective, seat, and setup. He still can't see the monitor, but he's got a better vantage point to the field. Now, if you'll notice, Joe Castiglione has a headset with a mic attached. Dave O'Brien prefers to have a stick mic built in so he can lean in and get a better look inside. Meanwhile, Sean McDonough, over to the side, has a very similar style as well. His style is a headset microphone. However, if you notice, he has a lot more beverages. Sean McDonough is a wonderful voice, and it brings a very precise analysis of the game. If you notice, there's a box between Sean and Dave. This is called the cough box. So basically, if you're going to sit and broadcast a 3-hour game, it's going to part you. And every now and then you want to make sure that you don't pop any sounds that are going to disturb your audience. So you'll push this button here. It mutes your mic so you can cough. You release it and you continue on. During the course of the game, you'll also need to hit upon certain what we call stingers, just those promos, those phrases, those commercial spots that advertisers will run, reminders for our audience. That is a low-tech solution here, simply taped up on one of the support beams in this old ballpark. You'll also notice that over Joe Castiglione's shoulder here, you see stat sheets highlighted, pinned, relevant to that day's game. Each of these three has a very different approach to how they broadcast this game, but this booth is designed and laid out for the radio. That contrasts to the building where I graduated and also called some very significant hockey games, the TD Garden. If you're familiar with American sports, this is the home to the Celtics and the Boston Bruins. Northeastern got to call games there as part of an annual tournament where they would play against Harvard or Boston University, Boston College. I also got a chance to interact with the professional broadcasters for the Boston Bruins, since the same company owns both the Red Sox and the Bruins. So this is the broadcast booth for the television broadcast for the Boston Bruins. The two gentlemen you see here, Jack Edwards, Andy Brickley, decades of experience calling hockey, very closely associated to the scene over the last decade or so. Now, if you notice, their setup is a little higher up over the ice, similar to what I had at Northeastern University, but they broadcast television. So their setup is going to be very different because they're going to have a closer hand into what the viewer sees, not just hears. So while they do have the feed of the game over to the side, they also have devices that allow them touch interaction with the graphics that the viewer will see that supplement the actual flow of the game. So you'll see both teams have their lines. You can just touch one player and their number and their name, and a little icon that has their face on it shows up on screen for the viewer. Any type of stats that may be relevant to the situation, they can touch that and pop it up. It allows them to have a detailed hand on the story they want to tell to the viewer at home, because radio versus television is very different because of what your viewer has access to and the senses that are involved. Now, the reason that I share this is because this idea of crafting your workspace for the purpose of the work, for who's using it, is kind of the golden goose of efficiency, not just in broadcasting, but in any type of workplace. And a lot of the times that gets lost in education because we're stuck in time. We have this idea of what a classroom has to be, and traditionally, when it's depicted in media, it looks very similar to what it was 100 years ago. But we as educators know better because we're in the trenches. We recognize the needs of students. We're in classrooms more than I think a lot of students are. And so we start to envision what we want that ideal workspace to be. And I think we're at a really unique time to really think about what an ideal workspace is. So I want to start off with a little bit of a brainstorm activity to bring this back into education. We have a very unique opportunity right now to kind of step back to what our classrooms have been. Some of us have been in our spaces for many years, going on decades, the same classroom. And the type of people that are in this room, it doesn't look the same every year, but we still have that dream. We still have that vision. So if you could, in the chat, do me a favor, spend a couple of minutes typing in how your dream or ideal classroom design differs from your most current or your most recent classroom. Make a comparison, what you have versus what you would love to see. What would you like to have in your classroom? Let's check the chat. We'll do this for a couple of minutes here. Kids, I get it. We'd love to see them there. Can't have it now. Let's wait. We'll get there though. Space is so important. The idea of being able not just to maneuver around, but to do more with what we have. Space is like time. It's a valuable commodity that all of us seem to have, but nobody ever has enough of. I think that the idea of getting out of a classroom is something that's picking up steam as well. The idea of portability or modular spaces, the ability to change the purpose of a part of the room to fit a need. Maker spaces are making a big comeback. Absolutely. The idea of, what I talked about before, I never really referred to my classroom as a classroom. I was never classroom 8 on my campus. We were in Studio 8. I referred to my classroom as a studio because of the idea that in a studio, you make things, you design things, you build things. And students were very much on board with the idea of using the learning to make something as a product of their understanding. More space in the front of the room. I think that's something we're going to touch upon as well. The idea of, orientation and positioning is something we're always playing around with. And, that's not exclusive to education either, but we don't really think about how others consider that approach there. The idea of zones, of dedicated spaces within a classroom space. How do you differentiate? How do you split that up? So we have our ideals. One of the most interesting things that has come about in the COVID era of education has been the idea, and I've seen a couple of presentations through through the Twitter sphere about this, is the idea of Bitmoji spaces or virtual classrooms. And I don't know if you've noticed this trend as well, but a lot of teachers are into the idea of designing this idea of a virtual classroom. You know, one of the things that you want to have as a core component of distance learning is a dedicated, committed hub, a central location where everything can kind of launch from. And while Google Classroom can be that, I think as a more visual, warm, engaging place, teachers are designing their own classrooms virtually. However, one of the more fascinating developments has been a lot of the classrooms that teachers are designing, they're trying to make them look exactly like their classrooms look like now. And I almost had the opposite sense of this. I almost think to myself, if I'm going to get to create a virtual space, why would I want it to make it look like a place that I already have that is flawed? So I started to think back, what would I love to have in my classroom? And the beauty of doing a virtual classroom is I can bring those in right now. I don't have to wait for approval to be able to bring those things in. So, you know, I would love to be able to have really modern looking wallpaper. I would love to have, you know, tiled floors. I would love to be able to have, how great would it be to have a Banksy in your classroom, right? Not for anything else, but just for status. And I just think this idea is really empowering, because when you go back to a physical classroom, what's to stop you from working towards this ideal? So the idea of a virtual space, not as a visual construct or representation remotely of what is already there. You know, when our kids come back, they don't know what our classrooms look like. This is a chance to establish norms and ideals before they even come in. I love the idea. I got this from Emma Pass, the idea of problem-driven objectives as a motivator, a kickstarter to the lesson. I know a lot of teachers are deep into learning intentions and success criteria. Don't throw them out, but the idea of relevancy, how do we use this? How are other people using this? Why is this important? To answer a question, not just about what problem we have to solve, but problems other people have to solve is really fascinating. That idea of how it's made using the learning that we have. The idea of quick links to resources that we already interact with frequently, but using this as that central hub. If I'm teaching a math lesson, I would love to be able to get the Desmos right away. Just that idea of an ideal, you know, because I don't think anybody would want to interact with a very bland, dark virtual classroom. And if that's the reality, why would they want to interact with a live version of that same thing? This comes from Ryan O'Donnell, this idea of just a template I started off with. I've included a link to his virtual classroom templates on slides. This was designed all in slide. And some of the timers, thanks to Clay Smith as well for his design on slides timer, I've been able to incorporate that as well. So I just wanted to kind of think about this. We have an opportunity to reconsider our ideal, reevaluate the space that we have right now as our classrooms as true learning spaces. And if they're true professional spaces, if we want to consider our kids professionals, how can we bring that there to facilitate what they need to be successful? Now, that's from the virtual perspective. Ideally, we'd like to start transitioning this into physical design consideration, right? The idea that ultimately we're going to have to lay out our classrooms. In the deck that I'm going to share at the end of this presentation, there's a couple of links to some classroom design tools. One comes from forteachers.org. Another is been posted up on Ginzy, which you may or not be familiar with. They both require Flash, and I know that's a very touchy subject. While we're living in Google Slides, I decided, why don't I play around with using slides as a classroom layout template? You'll get this to be able to interact with when you go to the link at the end of the presentation. But all I did here was take a grid from For Teachers, use the snipping tool to bring that image over, and then think about what that might look like using just common shapes that you could build in slides. So if you see this icon right over here, that fishhook looking thing is a door frame. So you can position that where your doors might be, lay out where your windows are. Some of the more traditional uh, fixtures that might be in a classroom are there, your kidney table, your bookshelf, your teacher's desk. You may want to consider moving that teacher's desk because space is not going to be at a premium when we get back into our classrooms. Now, each of these squares on this grid represents 1 foot by 1 foot. Your dimensions are going to be different based on the layout of your classroom. But the reason I bring that up is you may see this circle with the blue square and an arrow. In previous years, if I was doing a layout, that would simply just be a square. That would be a student's seat and a desk. However, the CDC's requirements when we get back to classrooms is that students, to match social distancing expectations, are 6 feet apart. So that square that represents a student seat is now within a circle that has a diameter of 6 feet. So that when you start dragging them and laying them out, you can at least start to visualize that. Now that's going to be a challenge. That's going to significantly hinder the number of students that we have in our classrooms. Now, whatever your districts or your schools or your trusts are starting to prepare or plan based on what that's going to look like, that might be above our payout scale, but that's a consideration that all of us are going to have to kind of figure out and play around with. But as far as classroom design, it's very relevant because it can still be something that we use creatively with the space that we have. And I'll get to that. Here's what I mean. I'm going to show you 4 pictures simultaneously. This isn't going to be a which one doesn't belong. It's not going to be one of these things is not like the other. All I want you to do is kind of in the chat, type in what similarities all 4 of these images have. So what do you notice about these 4 figures? Go ahead and throw that in the chat. What do you notice is common in all 4 of these spaces? This is a very wise group because, yeah, all of these images do have some sort of seating arrangements. Now, is there something that you notice about the seating arrangements themselves? Now, in some of them, yeah, the seating arrangements are somewhat together, which kind of shares the idea that relates to the purpose of each of these spaces, right? In each of these spaces, the purpose of the room is for people to come together. But in also each of these spaces, the purpose of the room is tied into the positioning of the seating. So in our living room space, our family room space, our living room space here, you come into this room to watch television. How do we know that? Because all of the seating, that big couch, is pointed towards the monitor. If you're going to go get Japanese teppanyaki and you're going to go at a hibachi restaurant, all the seats are positioned around the grill so that you can watch the cook do their magic. They're going to do the onion thing and make it a volcano and make it go choo-choo, and then they're going to spin the eggs and crack it on the spatula. You know the routine. We're all here to see it, and the seating is arranged around that. In a family room, the seating is centered so that everybody is facing everybody, because the purpose of that is the conversation with everybody in that space. And if you're going to a public space along the coast, you're going to see benches that are pointed out towards the ocean so that you can appreciate and take in the view. Now, at first, it looks like a lot of the seating is kind of established and set in. And that's really based on some of the fixtures. However, we don't have a ton of hard set fixtures in our classrooms. However, I do want to kind of focus on this idea of the seating directed towards a purpose. Which of these 4 do you think best represents the focus of our classrooms? Would you say it's the ocean? Would you say it's the family? Which do you think in your classroom represents your learning space right now? I think a lot of people are going to kind of come in common with one idea. I think a lot of people have an ideal I think some people focus on kind of like what their classroom is without really thinking about the broader picture too. I can tell you from experience being in a lot of classrooms in my role as a district specialist and an academic coach that unfortunately most of our classrooms are that living room. Right now we are kind of tied down by having to bear witness to the screen in the front of the room. Now, yeah, a lot of classrooms, you do see some group settings. You do see some collaboratives where kids are facing each other. However, despite a lot of the research about collaboration, we still see that a lot of the classrooms do face that standard norm of face the front wall. Now, when I taught at my classroom at Voorhees Elementary here in Bakersfield in 6th grade, I didn't like the idea that I had one wall that I had to make my priority. Because what happens? We know that if students are facing the wall, everything on that front wall, it has to be the most important things that we need students to be able to see. And unfortunately, that's why a lot of our students' work ends up on the back wall, right? Because even though we're proud of it, we want to give it the space, they don't need to be looking at it all day. And sadly, kids get that sense. By staring at one wall all day, it's not even just one wall, one section of that one wall. It's the projector. It limits the use of the rest of that wall space, and it's so invaluable. So what I did was I decided in my classroom, I wasn't going to have one front wall. I was going to have two. So what I did was I got rid of my teacher's desk. I got a podium, but instead of putting it next to the smartboard, which was a hardened fixture, I was not going to be able to move that anywhere. I decided to move my podium to the corner. And I dedicated 2 walls to my students. I shifted the orientation so that my students could very easily look at the smartboard or look at the dry erase, depending on the content that I needed them to focus on, but I could shift that. It doubled the focus space of the room just by turning my attention 45 degrees in the classroom. Now, what does this look like if we return to campus with distancing expectations as they are? In this space that was 30 by 30, I might be able to fit 15 students. However, I think that's a lot more than people would consider. Just because students need 6 feet apart doesn't mean that they can't be all the way back up against the wall. You don't have to have a full circle around them. A half circle, a quarter circle, perfectly acceptable. But they're not really focused on this podium. I'm not going to be standing here all day. I've given some of that space back by moving away from a teacher's desk. I've got a smartboard here, any dynamic type of media that I want students to be interacting with or visible, we can focus on that. Anything that needs to be a bit more static, that needs to just stay written or dry erased or work for math, I can, stay there. I prefer doing math on dry erase as opposed to a smartboard because I think smartboards tend to remove a lot of the work and learning very, very quickly. We tend to erase very quickly on smartboards because we need that space for something else. So by doubling the wall space, I actually double the presentation space that I have. And by the way, I'm very much looking forward to being able to maneuver and work with groups of 3 or 4 just on the fly very quickly in some of these gaps between the circles. That's going to be my small group space. That's going to be where I'm able to interact more with students. One of the other orientations I did as far as classroom layouts was at first ruled cruel and unusual punishments by a grade level peer that I had. In a classroom where I had 36 students, I had all their desks facing the wall. And that sounds awful. They could be staring at the wall all day. Well, no, they were only there 1 hour a day at their desks. The part of the day where they were doing independent work or differentiated personalized learning. Because the rest of the day, now we have this whole space in the middle for group learning or a quick small group work. They could sit on the floor. They could bring a chair. However they wanted to interact with whole group learning, they could. They were 6th graders. Where did they want to sit? On the floor. And when I asked them, they said, because it feels like kindergarten. And I asked if that was that fun in kindergarten? And they said, yeah, it's really the last time I really loved learning. And that stuck at me like a dagger because it was according to them, the last time they really felt a close kind of learning tree type of interaction with an educator, with kind of those fundamentals of what they saw learning as. So that was a real eye opener for me. But the idea of having space and taking that wall space back is something I continue to explore. I got to present on a topic of anchor charts. And, anchor charts are one of those topics where, we love doing them, but we quickly surround ourselves with too many anchor charts over time. And so one of the ideas I came forward with is if you have an old TV monitor or computer monitor and a Chromebook or a device that you don't really use, I would advise using it as a dynamic anchor chart. And here's what I mean. Put it in a space where kids are going to be staring off into the void if they check out of a lesson, and populate it with a slide deck that is on auto rotate, publish it to web so that it auto rotates every few seconds or so that if they're staring off at something, it's that relevant content that would be on a physical anchor chart. That way, instead of having 7 different anchor charts, you can have one monitor that rotates kind of like a moving billboard. Have it positioned in a space where it's not going to distract from the main learning, but if there's independent work, if students are stuck, they can wait, they can focus. They can cover a lot of concepts without having to stare at different parts of the room. They know exactly where it can be. Right now, since a lot of our schools have moved towards Chromebooks, we have a lot of monitors just kind of sitting around. And so just popping one in and using a mirrored monitor approach is a lot easier than I think a lot of teachers envisioned it used to be. One other consideration as far as monitors is the idea of a smartboard is very limiting because it's not always accessible to everybody in the room. You have your kids in the back that are not able to see what's kind of cut off on the bottom. There's only so much space for the kids in the front. So another trend that we're starting to see, which is actually pretty efficient and effective, is the idea of instead of using a massive interactive display in the front of the room, of using mirrored monitors throughout. So instead of simply just having one interactive display with 2 markers that you might be able to draw on the screen with, you might have instead just a standard big screen HD TV, which is cheaper than it's ever been, and then smaller monitors posted on the sides of the room that mirror that content. So even if you're in the back of the room, you can still see what's going on. If you truly need to interact with that big display, we really don't see it all that much often. And we've noticed that I've seen a couple of teachers in our district where, they have that shiny surface. You can just use a dry erase marker and interact with it in a very old school kind of way, but it still communicates that same message. And those monitors end up being so much less expensive. And generally, they're easier to set up. They're easier to manage and control. You can customize it with a universal remote. You can have multiple monitors set up in one room. If you have a science lab, think about what this does as far as making that microscope camera accessible to more people instead of everybody craning their necks over to see in front of the kid in front of them. It's an option that more and more schools and colleges, especially, and universities are becoming very friendly with. Before we move on, I want to take an opportunity to hit the chat and see if you have any other ideas for how you can utilize that physical space inside your classroom. Some things you've tried, some things you want to try. What are some of the things that you see happening in your spaces? Really neat. A floor plan of a classroom is so much like a canvas in that nobody's going to see it the same way, but it's going to be, I think, formed by our own experiences and how we utilize that space in our own mind. Okay, I'm going to change it up a little bit here. I'm not going to share this presentation right now, but I wanted to welcome you back and change the setting here. So when I got a chance to go to London for Innovator, my Innovator project was focused on this idea of the classroom. The idea that I would walk into a lot of dark spaces and students would be subservient. Teachers would just be bowed to the projector. And eventually, with a lot of light-based bulbs, they burn out, they get dim. And all of a sudden, instead of replacing the bulbs, teachers would paper over windows, and that, the doors would be shut, the lights are drawn, curtains all over, and it was just a really depressing space to be in. So when I got a chance to, I'm gonna go ahead and share very quickly again. When I got a chance to go to London through Innovator, thank you very much for the kudos on my Wi-Fi. I'll let my provider know that. When I got a chance to go to London, my Innovator project was based on these types of spaces. And so the How Might We challenge I brought with me was, how might we encourage learning environments that are less dependent on front displays and more amenable to healthier lighting? Have you guys ever done the Google Arts and Culture, where you take a picture of yourself and it shows up as like a piece of art and it tries to match you as closely as possible? So I did that when I came back from London, and a really wild and amazing thing happened. This is what came back. For those of you that are unfamiliar with this amazing gentleman, his name is Ben Rouse. He was my coach for Innovator. And he was the one that really kind of spurred me forward on thinking about my challenge. So he goes, okay, so you want to improve lighting conditions for learning. He goes, what's the best lighting that you have access to on your campus right now? And here I come, a New York smartass, by way of California, over to the UK, just trying to sound like a smart guy in, Google's London headquarters. Like, I don't know, the sun. and I laughed, and then I stopped laughing, because that was the right answer. The outdoor light is literally the best you could ask for on a beautiful day. And at that moment, my how might we changed. Interesting note on that. The topic of this came from a conversation we had when we tried to come up with our Innovator team names. The Audacity of Light comes from Looks Audacity. And I tried to come up with like a very elegant, very symbolic type of badge type of thing. We ended up with an homage to the Magic School Bus instead. No problem with that. But I love this idea of light in education, and it seems to have escaped us. So it went from my original how might we to how might we shift learning environments towards better lit existing spaces on campuses. And the big challenge wasn't that teachers didn't want to go outside. It was that so many of their resources are now digital. And it's very difficult to bring digital resources outside. You have Chromebook considerations. There's still a lot of worksheets involved. And frankly, a lot of Chromebooks are not very visible. The brightness is not great when you have better lighting outside. So I decided I would embark upon a solution that might end up being one of the, if not the most low-tech Innovator projects in history. And I want to go ahead and just kind of share that with you right here, because many of you have had a little bit of a preview of it. This is the Outsider. It is a PVC pipe and solar fabric podium that is portable. It fits with most of your standard classroom doors. It not only protects any devices for light, it also protects it from overheating in the sunlight and temperature. Right now, it is 104 degrees here in Bakersfield, California. Sun blasting. I put this thing under a shade, and it feels just as cool as it is on the inside when I was starting on this presentation. Now, just to kind of give you a little bit of a vision on what this would look like in a classroom setting outdoors, each of these markers, I have no access to children that are not my own right now, so I was not going to subject them to a live model demonstration of this. I want you to envision that each of these cones here is a student. Distance-wise, 6 feet apart. And I can tell you from right here, I can see every single one of you in that grid that is watching this live on Google Meet right now. It is clear. If I wanted to bring a Bluetooth speaker so that I could play media, I'd be able to see everything and follow along. And what's beautiful about the portability of this is once students start working independently, they can roll this device to the small groups directly. So you can have those closer conversations for deeper interactions. One of the fascinating things I found when I tested this on my campus is a lot of teachers were worried about student behaviors and being unable to control them. For the classes I tested, I allowed students to self-select how they sat and where they sat. And fascinatingly, in every single case, they chose to sit in a straight single line next to each other so that they could collaborate more effectively with their neighbor and their partner next to each other. There are a lot of benefits to outdoor learning that are now being realized. The idea that it's wonderful for physical, mental, and social health. The idea that it inspires students to be more physically active even after the lesson's over. There's also a lot that shows that retention of content is heightened following immediately after an outdoor lesson. And the great thing about an outsider is that you don't have to design an outside lesson. You just take an existing lesson that you already have on your Chromebook and you bring it out with you. And then as soon as you're done with the outside part, as soon as you get your fresh air, come right back in and wrap things up. It's going to allow you to take advantage of more of the space that you have on campus so that you're not cramped in the same setting. I did not have any vision that this would be the time for something like this, but it's been kind of the culmination of where I wanted this to lead to. And, you know, it's an opportunity, it's a moment that I hope that we have the chance to share when we get back to our campuses, if we're not already there. We can bring the light back to learning. We can get more out of the experience. And when we take what we want as we re-envision learning spaces, there's no way we go back to how it used to be. I want to thank you so much for joining me today here. We'll hold up right here on the recording for Q&A, but for those of you watching, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and work with you here. I'll go ahead and put the short link in the chat as well.